Hello! In this second module, we're going to be covering general budget considerations, a little bit more on internal controls, and we're also going to take a deeper dive into the concept of cost principles, especially how they relate to TRIO programs. The items listed here are likely already considerations that you're making during the application and budgeting process when you're considering applying for a grant. Starting with a strong internal control environment can help ensure compliance during the entire life cycle of the grant. So let's take a deeper dive to explore what that means about a strong internal control environment. COSO is a joint initiative of the 5 private sector organizations and is dedicated to providing thought leadership through the development of frameworks and guidance on enterprise risk management, internal control, and fraud deterrence. The framework develops principles and supporting points of focus within each of the 5 foundational components of internal control, which are listed here as the points of the star. The arrows illustrate the ongoing process that it takes to continually reassess and update controls as necessary. Again, internal control is the concept that an entity provides reasonable assurance that they're managing the award in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the award in the context of federal funding. Internal controls serve to prevent collisions, and in your case, that collision is non-compliance. Organizations will utilize the risk assessment to determine which controls to implement. OMB recognized that the controls will vary from organization to organization based on size, infrastructure, risk, etc. The best practices will assist management in determining which controls are necessary to ensure compliance. What you will do will depend on the facts and circumstances. The methods are no longer prescribed to you, but rather an organization will need to exercise judgment and implement controls for their environment. Listed here are best practice standards such as the Green Book, the COSO, and Part 6 of the Compliance Supplement, which is issued by OMB. We'll go through the next 5 slides quickly. They'll serve to set the stage at a high level for the remaining conversation related to internal controls and to provide you some context for the 5 components of COSO. These will be discussed in much greater detail in the COSO course of this training, and the material has been provided to you for future reference as well. The control environment principles listed here are the overarching statements that are true of a strong control environment as a whole. These include tone at the top and organization-wide concepts. An organization will not be able to address and mitigate every risk identified. However, it's important to have a dedicated process in place to evaluate risks and to apply judgment in designing appropriate controls to address those risks. This is an ongoing process that needs to be revisited on a regular basis and on an as-needed basis when potential issues are identified. Control activities are the processes and checks and balances put in place by an organization to mitigate the risk of noncompliance, fraud, and human error. The principles and underlying attributes represent the requirements necessary to achieve the standards of internal control. A system of internal controls is built on the availability of reliable, accurate information and communication of that information to the appropriate individuals within and outside of the organization. Risk assessment, designing effective control activities, gathering information, and communicating is all great, but if there's no one responsible for evaluating the process, there's a chance that weaknesses may not be identified and rectified in a timely manner. This underscores the importance of monitoring activities as a capstone to the COSO framework. The next section that we'll cover is a more extensive look at the cost principles in uniform guidance and specific to TRIO programs. We'll take a deeper dive into allowable costs, indirect costs, and prior approval, as these concepts are integral to the effective administration of TRIO programs. These are the general considerations for allowable costs, and there are additional requirements to consider for each of the specific TRIO grant programs in existence. The general requirements are outlined in Subpart E of Uniform Guidance, which cover sections 200.400 to 200.475. TRIO program-specific considerations are outlined in grant agreements and the compliance supplement. Additionally, the Department of Education publishes resources on their website that are publicly available. Here we've listed each of the TRIO programs that could be in existence at an organization. These are considered a cluster by the Office of Management and Budget. What that means is that if one or more of the programs exist, they must be tested in conjunction with each other. This goes back to the concept of major program selection. If an organization has Upward Bound and Educational Opportunity Centers as programs that they receive funding for, these programs will be tested collectively, not individually. Indirect costs are designed to capture and allocate costs not directly associated with a cost objective or a program activity. Organizations allocate indirect costs using a reasonable basis to all cost objectives, which include federal and non-federal cost objectives. As we mentioned before, the de minimis rate of 10% offered by the Uniform Guidance is allowed, and that 10% is calculated based on the modified total direct costs for entities. Again, these are entities that have never had a negotiated indirect cost rate. If an entity has a federally approved indirect cost rate plan, that would be obtained at the institution level. It would not be obtained program by program. You cannot do both of these or apply both of these indirect cost methods simultaneously. The indirect cost method applied to modified total direct costs includes all of the items on the slide. You will note that you can only apply the rate against the first $25,000 of your subawards or subcontracts, which are those funds that are passed through to subrecipients and to significant contracts. This typically isn't an area of concern or a significant area for TRIO programs. Modified total direct cost specifically excludes these items: equipment purchases, capital expenditures, charges for patient care, tuition remission, participant support costs, and the other items listed would not be able to be included when calculated modified total direct cost. Ultimately, your organization should document the procedures around using the de minimis rate, calculating the modified total direct cost, and actually applying the rate to federal grants if that is being used. Obtaining prior approval for specific costs from the organization's cognizant agency can prevent a headache in the future related to allowability questions. Prior written approval should include the time frame and scope of the agreement when requested. UG Section 200.407 lists specific costs that typically require prior written approval. These have been listed here for your benefit, and I will let you review. This is a continuation of the key items listed in Section 407 of Uniform Guidance. These are the last parts of the key items listed within the Uniform Guidance. As you can see, there are a number of costs included in the list that would normally be unallowable. Key takeaways to consider when developing a budget and monitoring expenditures of a program include reviewing the list that is included in Section 407 when building the grant application, determining if pre-approvals should be included in the grant document, and continually reassessing if facts change throughout the life of the grant. A process should be in place to check the list to see if pre-approval request is needed when expenditures are made. This concludes Module 2.